Unreal Engine 5 has become synonymous with stutter-struggle and is the source of dread for many a PC gamer. But does this engine actually have a silver lining? So Hardware Unboxed recently just did an updated video regarding 8GB VRAM GPUs, and I'm not going to be talking too much about that, except one thing that I did notice is that there aren't any Unreal Engine 5 games, right? So we have Callisto Protocol, Resident Evil, Horizon Forbidden West, etc., etc. And then, contrary to popular belief, we do have Forspoken, but Forspoken is not Unreal Engine 5, right? And in all the games he showed here, Steve showed here, there were issues with 8GB VRAM GPUs. So it got me thinking, what about Unreal Engine 5 games? Alright, so then just to explain my testing methodology here, we are going to have a look at Hellblade 2 Senua's Saga, and you can see there I've got VRAM usage in the top left hand corner. It's sitting currently at 6.4 gigabytes of VRAM used. I'm not going to be showing VRAM allocated just because it does confuse some people. Now I just want to verify the VRAM usage, right? So it says according to the game it's expecting to use 6.4 gigabytes of VRAM, and if we have a look at our VRAM usage in MSI Afterburner, it's around 6.45, right? So it more or less lines up. Now it's probably not 100% accurate, but we'll be using that for reference. So if we have a look at our settings here, currently we're at 1440p, DLAA, no frame generation, and we're on the high preset. This is the highest that the settings can go. And if we look at the advanced settings, everything is set to high. All right, so using these settings, we are more or less hitting 60 frames per second, right? It does drop below 60 every now and again, but it's pretty close, that I probably wouldn't mind if my aim was 60 frames per second. And you can see we are using around 6.5 gigabytes of VRAM. Now this game is being touted as one of the best looking Unreal Engine 5 games to date, and I have to agree, some aspects of the game really do look great. Now you have to keep in mind that this is letterboxed and it's not true 1440p, it's slightly less than 1440p, so VRAM usage might go up slightly. Now if we just compare that with 8GB VRAM GPUs, they start to run into issues at around 7 gigabytes of VRAM usage, right? Because some VRAM is being reserved for other stuff. So I've seen them at around 7.1 gigabytes of VRAM used, they start to run into issues. But the fastest 8GB VRAM GPU that we currently have is a 3070 Ti, and you're not going to be getting 60 frames per second using these settings anyway, right? So this game will be perfectly fine on an 8GB GPU using settings to get 60 frames per second. Now I know that frame generation also increases VRAM usage, so let's go have a look at that. Now just one thing, unfortunately the in-game tool that shows you how much VRAM you are using does not update when you actually enable frame generation. So let's just go back into the game quickly and refresh our numbers. Now we are sitting with 6.9 gigabytes of VRAM used. Now I know this is a very small area. There are definitely some other areas that might be more demanding. I just haven't progressed that far. Not really my type of game, although it's a very good looking game. Not really finding it that enjoyable. Anyway, that's beside the point, but you can see we are creeping up to that 6.97 gigabytes VRAM used. So 8GB GPUs would start having issues around about here, right? But then again, you won't be using these exact settings with an 8GB GPU anyway, because they won't be able to hit 60 frames per second base frame, which I'd say is the minimum for you to start enabling frame generation anyway. Right, so I've just been running around a little bit, and you can see that our VRAM usage has crept up to 7.1 gigabytes. They're almost 7.2. But once again, as I said, you won't be using 8GB GPUs, or you won't be using these settings with 8GB GPUs anyway, because the fastest one is a 3070 Ti, and it is quite a bit slower than a 4070 Super. So anyway, no problem here whatsoever expected on 8GB GPUs. Right, let's move on to the next one. Alright, so next up we've got the Finals, which is a competitive online shooter, and currently we are running everything epic with DLAA and frame generation enabled. We've got RTX global illumination set to dynamic epic as well, and while we are getting a pretty decent frame rate, the input latency is is not that great because I'd personally prefer to use DLSS at least if I'm enabling frame generation, but it's pretty good, and you can see that our VRAM usage is sitting at 5.8 gigabytes of VRAM used, and I'm probably going to die because I'm not concentrating at all. And I mean, once again, these are settings that you probably can use on a 4060 Ti, and you should be fine because as you can see, we're using around 6 gigabytes of VRAM. And if you do want a slightly higher frame rate, obviously, seeing that it is a competitive shooter, you will drop down the settings because you do want the highest frame rate, the lowest input latency to be competitive. Me, I don't care because I really do suck at these kind of games, and I never used to. It's just I'm quite old at the moment, so well, not at the moment. I'll be getting older from here on out, obviously. It's just that my reflexes and response time, etc., is just not what it used to be. And so I just don't play these kind of games. But you can see 6.2 gigabytes of VRAM used here, and it's perfectly fine. It should be perfectly fine even on 8 gigabyte GPUs. And just one thing that I need to also note is that because we do have 12 gigabytes of VRAM available, sometimes the game will allocate and use more VRAM than it would on something like an 8 gigabyte VRAM GPU. Just that some games like to use more VRAM when it is available, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that this is what the usage will be on all GPUs. All right, let's move on to the next one. All right, so next up we've got the first Descendant, and it's a game that I actually did play for a few hours. Did get a little bit boring, but apparently it does get better the further you play, so I'll be giving it another shot. And here we are playing everything on Ultra. We've got RT set to Ultra, we've got the graphical preset set to Ultra, and we are using around 6.6 gigabytes of VRAM in this specific scene. Other areas are slightly less demanding and other areas are slightly more demanding, but this is not how I would play this game anyway, because we're not even hitting 60 frames per second. But using these exact same settings on an 8 gigabyte GPU should be fine as well, and on a 12 gigabyte GPU you won't have any issues at all with VRAM, right? So let's just quickly see what kind of settings we actually do need just to get around 60 frames per second, and then we'll enable frame generation as well, and as that also uses a little bit more VRAM, right? So I'm just going to leave the frame rate counter open. Sorry if it's a little bit in the way. We'll just use DLSS quality. I think that should be enough. So DLSS quality gets us around 70 frames per second, and if we just reset our numbers here quickly, now our VRAM usage is still sitting at around 6.2, 6.3 gigabytes of VRAM. And I mean, it might creep up a little bit the more you play. Right, but just running around a little bit, you can see that the VRAM actually creeps up to around 6.5 gigabytes now. But as long as we stay under around 7 gigabytes of VRAM used, we should be fine even on 8 gigabyte GPUs. And if you are running on a 12 gigabyte VRAM GPU, no issues whatsoever. Right, so let's just quickly enable frame generation. Let's see what the impact is on the VRAM there. Remember, we were sitting at around 6.5 gigabytes, and if we just enable frame generation, now we are sitting at around 7. So this probably won't work on an 8 gigabyte GPU at all. But then again, we were getting around 70 frames per second, and as I said, this GPU is quite a bit faster than the 3070 Ti. The 3070 Ti does not support frame generation, right? So we'll be looking at something like a 4060 Ti 8 gig, and this GPU is about 50% faster than a 4060 Ti 8 gigabyte. So you won't be using these settings anyway on an 8 gigabyte GPU, because you won't be able to get 60 frames per second to base before you enable frame generation. So I wouldn't be too concerned about this game either. Using respectable settings on 8 gigabyte GPUs will be perfectly fine. Alright, that's going to be it for the first Descendant. Let's move on to the next one. Right, so next up we've got Grey Zone Warfare, and I'm just running around in the base here, and you can see we are already sitting at 8.3 gigabytes of VRAM used. Now this is at 1440p, everything on ultra, and no frame generation, but also DLAA. It's the Epic preset, I believe. So it's we're not getting 60 frames per second constantly, right? And there will be areas further into the game or further into the jungle that will be more demanding than this specific area. But you can see this game is quite VRAM demanding, and as I said, this is without frame generation even. So let's just quickly go ahead and see what happens once we enable frame generation. I'll just go over the settings with you as well quickly. So you can see here we are running on the Epic preset, everything Epic, and then we do have DLSS enabled down here, but you can see that it's DLAA, right? So no frame generation, so we'll go ahead and enable that right now, and you can see that frame generation does use a chunk of VRAM. We went up another 500-600 megabytes of VRAM, right? So 9.2 gigabytes. But just once again, I just want to reiterate the point that this GPU is 50% faster than a 4060 Ti, and you won't be using these settings on an 8 gigabyte GPU anyway. But this is just to give you the worst case scenario. I've seen a lot of people say that maybe 12 gigabyte of VRAM is not enough either. But yeah, you can see that this game is quite heavy, but we're getting pretty okay-ish performance. I personally wouldn't play like this because we were not able to maintain 60 frames per second before we enabled the frame generation. I personally aim for around 90 frames per second before I enable frame generation. So using settings like that will probably reduce our VRAM usage by around a gig, right? So using those exact same settings on a 4060 Ti 8 gigabyte, you will definitely run into VRAM issues. I can guarantee you that. This I've seen that personally just on the 2070 Super, right? It's the only 8 gigabyte GPU that I currently have. But as I said earlier, the more VRAM you have available, sometimes games make use of that and they actually start using more VRAM than what is actually required. But this game will definitely have issues on 8 gigabyte GPUs using these exact same settings. All right, let's move on to the next one. All right, so here we have Lords of the Fallen, and once again, okay, actually, it's going to sound strange, but also not my type of game. It seems like there's very few games that I actually do like, or that's actually my type. It's not the case, but Souls games I do find very difficult, right? Anyway, so we are actually on the cinematic preset here without upscaling. Remember that the presets actually do enable upscaling. So I just enabled the cinematic preset and disabled any upscaling. We're not using frame generation either. And I mean, we're not getting 60 frames per second, but this is as good as the settings, or as high as the settings will go on this 1440p monitor of mine. Anyway, we're not hitting 60 frames per second, but also we are only using 5.2 gigabytes of VRAM. So no problem whatsoever. If you want to play at these settings, you'll probably get around 30 frames per second on a 4060 Ti, 8 gigabyte, and you won't run into any VRAM issues at all, right? So let's just quickly see. We're going to leave it on the cinematic preset here. I just want to show you the settings quickly. So if we go here, graphics, it's set to custom, right? But it's because I disabled the DLSS. It's cinematic. That's literally the highest setting you can go. And once we enable the cinematic preset, you'll see that once we applied, it does enable DLSS balance, right? So we're not going to use DLSS balance. We are just going to use DLAA, and then I'm going to enable frame generation. This gives you worst case scenario for this game at 1440p, right? When it comes to VRAM usage anyway. And we are still sitting at 5.6 gigabyte. I keep on pressing shift to run. It's actually V. It's such a silly keyboard layout. But it's just going to run around a little bit. We are still under 6 gigabytes of VRAM used, right? It might creep up a little bit depending on where we are, and I'm probably going to die here because there's some guys on the roof here as well, and I'm out of stamina, and there we go. Predicted that. But you can see here, not settings that I would use anyway to play this game, but maxing out this game at 1440p only consumes 5.8 gigabytes of VRAM, so that's perfectly fine for pretty much any GPU, right? All right, let's move on to the next one. Okay, and next up we've got a Nightingale, and at launch this game was the poster child for stutter-struggle for Unreal Engine 5 games. It seems to have gotten slightly better. Sorry, it's night in here. Actually, when I tested earlier and I left the game, it was it was light. I do think that the time passes because it's an online realm that I'm playing. Anyway, doesn't matter. We're getting 50 frames per second here. We are using the ultra quality preset with DLAA. No frame generation just yet, but you can see that these are not settings you'd probably use with this game anyway. And we are using 7.3 gigabytes of VRAM. So let's just see what kind of settings we actually need to get 60 frames per second, and then we'll enable frame generation. Or actually, let's just enable frame generation to give you worst case scenario, right? That's basically what I want to show you in this video as well. So 1440p, ultra quality, everything. And then under performance boost, we got frame generation, right? It's experimental, so whatever. We'll just reset our numbers. Now we are using 7.8 gigabytes of VRAM. We're getting 80 frames per second, but the input latency is pretty bad. And we are definitely far above that 7 gigabytes VRAM used that I'd say is the maximum for 8 gigabyte GPUs. But for a 12 gigabyte VRAM GPU, this is perfectly fine, right? We're not, I mean, this is not settings that I would use, as I said. So we'll probably use settings that'll drop this down to around drop this down by about 1 gigabyte of VRAM used, and we're still perfectly fine on a 12 gigabyte GPU, not so much on a 8 gigabyte GPU. All right, so let's just quickly see. I know this is going to be a little bit out of order. I just want to quickly see what kind of settings we need to use to actually get 60 frames per second here. So I'm just going to disable frame generation, and then we're just going to, I'm going to leave the frame rate counter up there. Let's just see if we drop this down to quality, we should be able to get 60 frames per second, right? So there we go, 68 frames per second. VRAM usage hasn't come down yet, but it should. Actually, it's creeping up again. Okay, so getting 60 frames per second here with these settings. Personally, once again, I'd aim for a little bit higher, so we'll probably use DLSS quality. We're not going to do that now because it's not about optimizing settings, it's about VRAM usage in this video. So let's enable frame generation, and let's see, so that goes up to 8.2 gigabytes of VRAM usage, right? Let's just reset our numbers. But the game feels okay. Input latency is pretty high, and but I've never found this game to be extremely responsive, but the stutters are definitely a lot less than it was than they were at launch, right? But you can see we're using 7.4 gigabytes of VRAM here, slightly over that 7 gigabytes of VRAM used for 8 gigabyte GPUs. But once again, on the fastest 8 gigabyte GPU that supports frame generation, you won't be using these settings anyway because you won't be able to get 60 frames per second. All right, so I think that's it. Let's move on to the next one. All right, so the next game is Nobody Wants to Die, and currently we're at 1440p on the Epic preset. This game does not have any frame generation, and we are basically maintaining 60 frames per second here, and we are using around 7.7 gigabytes of VRAM. This is actually a pretty demanding scene. The game has very small levels, like it's not open world. You do enter these levels and you have to start your investigation, etc. But you can see we're not able to maintain 60 frames per second, right? So let's just go ahead. This time I'm going to leave the frame rate counter up there. Just going to make it a little bit smaller, and if we just drop this down to the high preset, now we are getting around 86 frames per second, right? And look at our VRAM usage there. It dropped from above 7 to below 6 gigabytes, and this is probably how I'd personally play this game, but I'd still enable DLSS. Even if it's a slow paced game like this, I'd daily a 165 Hz monitor, and I'd like to make use of that. So with DLSS set to quality, the game runs at around 120 frames per second, pretty much using these settings, and VRAM usage goes down a little bit more. But if we have to compare this with something like a 4060 Ti 8 gigabyte, you can see we're using 5.7 gigabytes of VRAM here, and the 4060 Ti probably won't maintain 60 frames per second with these exact same settings, so you'll have to use DLSS quality anyway. But just to show you that Epic preset, usually, I mean, it's reserved for the elite guys with the 4080 Supers and 4090s, etc. And I mean, height looks plenty good. It's not as heavy, get a decent frame rate, and VRAM usage is very low actually. Alright, so I've been running around for about 2 minutes now, and the VRAM usage hasn't moved. It's sitting at 5.724, and I think it's pretty decent, right? The VRAM management in this game is definitely not horrible if you use respectable settings. Sure, the level is quite small, but I think it's pretty decent nonetheless. Alright, let's move on to the next one. Alright, so next up we've got Palworld, and once again we're running at 1440p on the Epic preset, no upscaling. The Game Pass version of this game does not support DLSS, but the Steam version does, but we're not running DLSS here at all. I don't have any ammo, and you can see we're getting around 90 to 100 frames per second here, and our VRAM usage is sitting at 3.6 gigabytes, which is very, very low. It's an open world game, and I was expecting VRAM usage to be slightly more, but sure, the game's visuals aren't that impressive, so there's probably not too much that has to go into the VRAM, except like textures, etc. still look plenty good. I do think it's I mean, the art style is different, and it's definitely not a bad looking game, and we are seeing very, very good VRAM usage here. Not going to change any other settings anyway, as these settings would get you 60 plus frames per second on a 4060 Ti 8GB anyway, and you can see we are sitting at 3.2 gigabytes of VRAM used, so no problem whatsoever with 8 gig or 12 gigabyte GPUs here. Alright, let's move on to the next one. Alright, so next up we've got Remnant 2, and if you remember, this game received a lot of flack when it launched because DLSS was basically a requirement. We're at 1440p on the Ultra or Epic preset, whichever one is the highest, can't remember now, and we are using around 6.2 gigabytes of VRAM, right? We are getting above 60 frames per second, so this would be perfectly fine for anybody with an RTX 4070 Super. Once again, with these kind of settings, a 4060 Ti 8GB probably won't hit 60 frames per second, or it won't hit 60 frames per second. Remember, the 4070 Super is about 50% faster than the 4060 Ti 8GB, and so we'd need around 90 frames per second on this GPU to get 60 on the 4060 Ti. Alright, so I mean, still, VRAM usage is perfectly fine here, but that's without frame generation. So let's go ahead and enable frame generation quickly and see what the VRAM usage goes up to. As you can see, we're on the Ultra preset, and like everything is set to its highest, right? Detail, shadows, everything. So, and DLAA. So we'll just use frame generation. Once again, I personally would use DLSS with frame generation. So VRAM usage would drop down a little bit, but the game runs perfectly fine, and the game feels pretty responsive actually, and we are sitting with 6.6 gigabytes of VRAM used. Now the game's areas do change quite a lot. The levels are actually procedurally generated, and so no single area would be the same, or two playthroughs would be the same. And sometimes you, after the intro or tutorial of the video, you do get transferred to different biomes. I mean, once I've actually started playing in like a snow kind of area, and this is a jungle forest kind of area. So there are a lot of variables in this game, and I'm not saying that this the VRAM usage won't be higher in other areas. It's just in my specific testing, we are actually perfectly fine, and even on 8 gigabyte GPUs, you'd be perfectly fine with these kind of settings, right? Not frame rate wise, but VRAM wise. All right, let's move on to the last one. Alright, so getting to our last game, this is Robocop Rogue City. I do love benchmarking this game, and you can see we are not able to maintain 60 frames per second at all times. We're at 1440p on the Epic preset with DLAA. As soon as there's glass breaking, we do drop below 60 frames per second. Let me just heal before I die, that'll be embarrassing. Anyway, so we're getting around 60 frames per second here. Everything's set to its highest, and we are using 5.7 gigabytes of VRAM. So VRAM usage definitely not an issue, even if you were to play this game on an 8 gigabyte GPU. With frame generation, it will be slightly higher. So let's go ahead and enable frame generation right away. Right, so as you can see, 1440p DLAA Epic preset, and we'll just enable frame generation here and see what effect that has on our VRAM usage. And let's just reset the numbers. I'm probably going to die again. So now we are getting 6.6 gigabytes of VRAM used. It probably will go slightly higher, and I'm going to die again because I'm not concentrating. And although we are still below that, I'd say like an ideal 7 gigabytes of VRAM used, especially if you do have an 8 gigabyte GPU. It probably will creep higher depending on where we are. This is the game is also broken down into smaller levels, except when you actually get past this mission, you get to the city, and it's kind of more open world, but not completely, right? So 6.5 gigabytes of VRAM used, no issue whatsoever. And if we just use settings that I personally recommend, I mean, we'll just drop this down to the high preset, right? I'll enable DLSS quality myself, but let's just see what the difference is. We were sitting at around 6.3, 6.5, and now we're sitting at 5.8, getting a very decent frame rate, and VRAM usage is very low. All right, so just conclusion, you can click off if you want. I personally don't listen to YouTubers' conclusions. I'd like to make my own, but Unreal Engine 5 does seem to manage VRAM quite well. Many games so far, well, I've only tested 10 games, and only in one of them we would probably be running out of VRAM on an 8 gigabyte GPU. But then again, that was with settings that probably wouldn't be used on an 8 gigabyte GPU anyway. As I said, the 4060 Ti is the fastest 8 gigabyte GPU with frame generation, and the 3070 Ti is the fastest 8 gigabyte GPU without frame generation. So I mean, take it as you will. But my main gripe with 8 gigabyte GPUs is it's just a 4060, right? The 3060 launched with 12 gigabytes of VRAM, and 2 years later the 4060 launched with 8 gigabytes of VRAM. And although it did have frame generation, slightly better ray tracing performance, whatever, the performance increase between the 3060 and 4060 was very minimal. And also you actually had to make compromises on the 4060 when it comes to texture quality and settings, etc., to not run out of VRAM, which you didn't have to do with the previous generation 60 class, right? The 3060 having 12 gigabytes of VRAM meant that, sure, you probably won't use ultra epic settings and get 144 frames per second, but you could increase texture quality and you wouldn't have an issue. Whereas with the 4068 gig, you'd need to drop down texture quality to maintain the same kind of performance, right? And that's personally my issue with 8 gigabyte GPUs currently. If the 4060 came down to $250, I'd recommend it, right? Just for 1080p medium/high gaming, and for let's say competitive shooters, Counter-Strike, Overwatch, that kind of thing. But other than that, $300 8 gigabyte GPUs in 2024 should not exist. All right, that's just my opinion. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.